Gundam Reconguista in G is a very shitty anime. And it might be the worst anime of all time. I know it's probably an over-exaggeration to say, but after watching the entire series as a whole, and also watching all 5 of the movies, I don't think it's unfair to me to say this. Almost everything does not work for G-Reco. To the story, to the characters, to its world building,
and so on and so forth.
It would have been really difficult to review this one because, truth be told, I probably would have not reviewed this one if it was just another bad Gundam show. Now you might be wondering why I'm reviewing this one in the first place, despite being another bad Gundam show and movies. Well, I'm gonna tell you right now. The biggest reason why I'm reviewing G-Reco is because of its director, Yoshiyuki Tomino. Now Tomino needs no introduction, but for those of you unaware, he was one of the creators of the original Mobile Suit Gundam, and he did pave the way for mecha anime by pioneering the real robot subgenre. And although he wasn't the first to start off a couple of tropes that mecha anime is known for, he was the first to have humans as the enemy rather than aliens.
だから宇宙戦争にするための要するに敵味方の設定論っていうのは宇宙移民者と地球に残っている人たちっていう対立構造を作るということしかなくって、宇宙人なんか出している暇ないよってそれだけの話です。宇宙人でないんだから同類なんだから敵と味方に要するに内通するものとか敵と味方に肉親が分かれているっていうような状況っていうのから時代劇からずっとあることです。だからそういうものも意識的に組み入れなければいけないんだ。
He's an interesting individual that does have a vision of what he wants to make. Like for example, space exploration, where he did look at actual scientific research on the subject as accurate as possible, at least at the time. And even the robots themselves were treated more like, well, machines, contrasted with other anime that were trying to make them more like superheroes. So there was at least thought and effort put into it. And while the original Gundam does have a retro future look to it, which kinda makes it a bit dated, it still manages to be realistic, or at least plausible, even today. And even the retro futuristic look does give it a bit of a charm. And although it didn't start out great, with the TV series having low ratings, and the toy sales going down the shitter, it did manage to pick itself back up thanks to the model kits by Bandai.
ガンダムも、ある意味同じように番組はもう終わるけれども、実際にそれが、当時、スポンサーでプラモデルを扱っているところなかったですから、番組の中盤で盛り上がってきているところで、バンダイのスタッフっていうか、役員の方なんかが、版権元様に交渉に入ってたらしいんですよね。
They also managed to make the original series into a trilogy, and it also paved the way for Gundam's success. And after watching the Gundam trilogy itself, I could totally see why the series became successful, and why it became so well loved. However, it wouldn't last. You see, while Gundam was popular in the 80s, in the 90s, however, it was a different story, because Gundam back then was not doing well. Which in all fairness, this was at a time when all anime was struggling. There are some animes that did bounce back and actually became very successful at that time period. However, Gundam was not one of them. It wasn't until the early 2000s where Gundam became relevant again. And to make things worse, Bandai, the company that saved Gundam thanks to its sales, ironically became Gundam's downfall. Remember when they had the rights to make the Gundam models? Well, Bandai eventually bought Sunrise themselves, which means Bandai owns the entire franchise now, and Tomino has lost his own baby. Now adding that with production issues of Gundam F91 and Victory Gundam, and you have a pretty depressed man. It wasn't until years later when he returned to make Turn A in 1999. Now, Turn A was kind of a form of therapy for Tomino, and Tomino himself said that Turn A's production was one of the best times that he ever made an anime. Which is saying something out of what happened earlier, and even overcame his own depression, which, good for him. And while it didn't do well in the ratings, it still managed to become a cult classic, and it's still remembered fondly to this very day. And while I wouldn't say the ending was that good, I still think it's a satisfying conclusion for at least Tomino's version of Gundam. And although Tomino was done with Gundam, he wasn't done with anime, however. He was making other shows during that time, like Overman King Gainer. Now, believe it or not, both King Gainer and Turn A are actually very important of how G-Reco became to be. After the production of Turn A and King Gainer, Tomino was interested in making a new project called A Turn in Space. Now, despite the name, Tomino has mentioned that this has nothing to do with the original Gundam series, and it's going to be a completely separate story from that.
I'm currently not thinking of a story that's a continuation of Gundam. The reason is because to continue a series that has endured for over 20 years would require more help from other people. I'm thinking of creating stories that are somewhat close to the world of Gundam. For my next story, I'm thinking about something called Turn A Space.
So basically what Tomino said is that he wants to make a shared universe with Gundam. Which, sure, we're more accustomed to it now, and I'm sensing that a lot of you are cringing because of it. But you gotta keep in mind, this was back in 2002, and Tomino had his idea way beforehand. Which is actually kinda interesting and ambitious, and also kinda insane. Now fast forward to 2009, we get a short film that was developed by Tomino called A Ring of Gundam. Now there's nothing to really say much about this short, but there are some ideas that will eventually come up in G-Reco, like the space elevator for example. And sooner or later, New Tech Magazine would finally announce G-Reco, explain a bit more of the story, having more interviews with Tomino, and even showing some concept art. And once you look at it, you can kind of see the evolution between this to the G-Reco we have now. And even reusing old concepts, like the space elevator for example, and using that to make something new, which is something that I kinda like actually. To say the project was secretive was an understatement. In fact, they had to make a fake Gundam to trick people thinking that was the real one. So yeah, they were really serious about this series. Probably because it was actually pretty hyped at the time. G-Reco had a lot of talent from the anime industry, including some you might even recognize, like Kenichi Yoshida, who was the main character designer of this series. And fun fact, he actually did work with Tomino before by being the main character and mechanical designer for Overman King Gainer.
じゃあみんなが集まったらお祭りやれるんだならこう言うんだよキングゲイナメタルオーバーマンキングゲイナ
But he's probably most famous for making the character designs for Eureka 7, and looking at his art style, I can kind of see why they chose him. Like with Turn A, the character design actually kind of feels more unique and stands out. And I actually kind of dig it. Speaking of Turn A, some people who worked on that series also returned for G-Reco, including some former Capcom artists. Which, another fun fact, Akira Yasuda, or Akuman for short, also worked with Tomino before with Turn A Gundam. And like Yasuda, he had more involvement with the series, mostly with the character designs. And although he's back again, ironically enough, he's no longer the guy who's making the character designs, since they already have that one covered, and is now more focused on mechanical design. So it's mostly just the mobile suits, which in fairness are actually pretty good designs. So the same guy who made the character designs for Street Fighter, Darkstalkers, Star Ocean, and others, has also contributed designs for Yoshiyuki Tomino, which I kind of found a bit endearing. So it's not only the fact that Tomino is back, but he's also trying something new, like different designers for the characters, the mechas, and even the music's different this time, with Yugo Kanno being the composer, the same guy who also did the JoJo soundtrack. There were even people who worked on Attack on Titan to work on G-Reco, and who could really blame them? Tomino's like one of the big names of the anime industry, so working with one of the big names is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And even by the sole fact that a lot of people from the anime industry are working on this is another reason why I think people are intrigued by it. And I can understand why, because even I was a bit intrigued by this. After all, Turn A Gundam was actually one of my favorites from him, and it might be one of my favorite animes of all time. And surely Yoshiyuki Tomino, one of the best of the anime industry, can never do wrong, and has never screwed things up. Fuck! So yeah, despite its publicity, the series kind of fucking failed when viewed critically. Wasn't received well in Japan either. Like this guy, Toshio Okada. Oh yeah, it's you from the last video.
How is Gundam Reconguista? Gundam Reconguista is really bad. I was thinking, what are they doing? Compared to this Parasite, which was fairly interesting.
So yeah, this reception did not look good for Tomino. In fact, even Tomino admitted the show had issues. Although he did state he liked it personally, you have to remember, if the guy who's making it admitted that the show kinda sucked, is not a good sign. Well, it's really not that surprising, which, another fun fact, Tomino's not always perfect. Now, I'm not saying he isn't talented, but a lot of stuff that he makes are mostly misses than hits, and G-Reco's one of them. Now there were some people that did like G-Reco, like Gen Yorobuchi for example, saying that G-Reco made him Genki. But the overall consensus was that G-Reco was just not a good show. Now you would think this would also affect the sales of G-Reco, and the results would be overall terrible. But no, it's the exact opposite. G-Reco was actually very successful, to the point that it became the 22nd highest grossing anime of 2015. which is actually rather impressive. In fact, if G-Reco really was a failure, we wouldn't have the 5 compilation films to begin with. So in a way, G-Reco was indeed successful. But you know what they say, just because something that sells well doesn't mean it's actually good. Like McDonald's is successful, doesn't mean it's good for you. But the big question is, was it even worth it in the end?
No.
Well, that's why I'm here. I'm gonna be the one to do some analysis to G-Reco, since there's not a whole lot of videos on the anime anyway. And I think it'd be good if I voice my own perspective and opinions on G-Reco. So let's dive in, shall we? Number 1, the story. So when we first start off, we... Now you might be thinking that you missed an episode or two. After all, when it starts, it does seem like we missed something. But no, this is literally the start of G-Reco. Like, there's no introduction to see what the world's like, what's going on. It just cuts to the shit, and we already have some kind of battle already. Not to say you can't start off with a battle, but it's the very first thing we ever see of G-Reco. Like, there's no hook to get us into the story at all.
Cheesy.
And it's weird because they easily could have done this from the start. Because later on, we actually do see some sort of introduction. And I was like, oh, why wasn't that the introduction? Like, they could have switched these scenes up, and it wouldn't make much of a difference anyway. And in fact, it would actually improve the story structure. Anyhow, not only we're in a bad start, but it's also another sign that we're in big fucking trouble. And it's gonna get worse as we progress. Now you might be thinking, well, the show didn't have a great start, but maybe the movie will fix things. The scene is really just more of the same. There are some differences that I should point out, but I'm not gonna cover it all, since a lot of it's mostly the same anyway, and I'm not gonna cover all of that unless it's very significant. And besides, I don't want to say meanwhile all the time anyway. Meanwhile, the films do give us more context of what's going on. For example, in the show, it was actually rather confusing whose side they're on. In fact, when I first watched this, I thought they were on the same team trying to rescue this girl. Only to find out later that those guys are actually trying to fight each other. Like, there's no fight scenes or established dialogue to indicate this. No, that's really just a scene. It's just them saving this girl and the Gundam. And because of the lack of that information, it becomes all more confusing. But to give the films credit, they are much more clear than the show. They even add new scenes and dialogue to get the point across. Like the faction they're fighting, and what their goal is. Sure, it's not that great, but hey, at least it's better than the show. But to give you the TLDR, the Zaku looking guys are the Amerians. No, not the Americans, the Amerians.
Well, that's just lazy writing.
Anyway, the Jib-looking guys are from the Capital Guard, who are essentially the world police. Now the Capital Guard guys think that the Amerians are invading their territory. But in reality, what the Amerians are really after is this mobile suit. While the Amerians do manage to capture it, the Capital Guard guys manage to capture the pilot. And their conditions not that great. And worse yet, we don't get a proper introduction till later on, which is really annoying actually. But for clarity's sake, I'm gonna explain the plot to you as simply as possible. The basic premise is that the Capital Guard is run by this religious organization, and they worship this single space elevator which occupies the capital of the Earth. So they're kind of like the UN crossed with the Catholic Church. But there's a catch to that. While they do have control of the planet, they also make the rules, which means other countries have to follow suit, meaning that you gotta follow the rules no matter what. And the biggest rule is that they ban certain technologies and you cannot use them, named the taboo. Yeah, it's not creative, but just go with it. But what is a taboo? Basically, it's a rule that prevents certain technologies so the world can recover, and to prevent wars like the Universal Century. In fact, the only source of energy they're able to use are photon batteries, meaning that other sources of energy are out of the picture.
リギルドセンチュリーの間、キャピタルタワーで フォトンバッテリーが運ばれ続けてきました。スコード教の情けがあればこそ地球上は今日のように栄えましたのに。
And naturally, not everyone's happy about this. And it's the main reason why the Americans are pissed, since they can't make their own source of energy.
人類に宇宙世紀のような間違いをさせないため、
エネルギーと道具は道徳的に正しい使い方ができれば、
だからタブーにしているのです。
そういうことが独占の悪を生むのです。
So at first, the conflict is easy to understand. The Americans are pissed that they're not able to make their own energy, while the Capital Terrorists try to make the Earth recover, while also preventing universal century-scale wars. But here's the thing. When they mean by banning certain technologies, they mean like banning all types of energy. You can't use oil, you can't use coal, you can't use nuclear, and I'm not joking, you can't even use solar panels.
地球上に太陽光発電のパネルを張ればいいのに、キャピタルはそれを禁止しています。それって独裁で。
地球からだったんですよ。
That's right, they even banned solar panels, which is probably one of the most cleanest sources of energy out there. Look, I can understand why they banned other sources of energy, but all the stuff that you banned, why solar panels? Is it because of the fact they're more inefficient when compared to photon batteries? Or is it the fact they have their own problems, especially when you consider the carbon footprint? Well, good luck thinking that, because we never get an explanation on why that's the case. The movie version tries to explain it, but that doesn't even help. So we never get a proper reason why they're banning G-Reco, other than the fact they might cause more wars like the Universal Century, which, now that I think about it, is a little bit funny.
フォトンバッテリーの配給をスコード教によって統制しているのは、人類に宇宙世紀のような間違いをさせない。
Now the whole conflict doesn't start till a quarter of the anime, but eventually the Americans manage to capture our main characters and the G-Self, and the Capital Guard declares war on the Americans in hopes of bringing them back, which would be justified unless you ignore the fact the Colonel actually let him through.
今まで動かなかったんですよ。4人が乗ってか。ああ、ウィル長官。法王のご意志は G セルフというものは奪われつつあります。
Now here's where it gets more complex, because the Capital Guard guys are not honest with their beliefs as you think. Because for one, they use technology that's banned anyway, and even though they say this for saving the hostages, by the end, it's become more clear that it's more of an excuse for a war. And looking back on it, it's actually one of the few moments that's actually kind of intriguing for G-Reco. The fact that superpowers can use their own influence to make excuses for conflict. Which in this case, the Capital Army is now making weapons that are forbidden from the taboo, and using those to invade the American territory, which were already a threat. And all because just wanted to save the hostages. Which is actually not as far-fetched as you think, since governments can use this sometimes as an excuse. And I was like, okay then, this is actually something I can kinda accept for a cause of the war. And you'll think it'll stop there, right? Well, no. Because there's another reason why they're doing this. Because they're preparing for a secret invasion from outer space.
同時にキャピタルアーミーはアメリアとゴンドワンを牽制しつつも宇宙からの脅威へも対応しようとしているのです。
But some characters don't see the issue with this, because they see Toasanga as a holy place where they produce the photon batteries, which makes their society function. Well, it turns out they're actually a threat, and they're not happy that they're causing a war with forbidden technology. But here's the other thing, it turns out it's all a front. Because you see, their actual plan is to head towards Earth, known as the Reconguista. And it also turns out they're also a puppet government run by the Direct family. And they were responsible for kicking out another family known as the Rayhunters. And the reason why they did that is again head towards Earth, but also break the taboo, which the Rayhunters were not a fan of, which in turn they got killed for. And there's also more family drama with it. And you'll think they'll stick with that. Because it turns out the Toasangans are not the big cheese running things after all. It turns out it's actually the people from the Venus globe that's actually running things, which is led by the space president Lagu and his assistant. And the real reason why they're running things is that they're going to use the Venus globe to let humanity travel across the universe, since the solar system won't last forever. And peace was there for a while until it wasn't, because it turns out there's a mutation that's affected the populace, making them almost all deformed. And here's where the big twist is. The big twist is that the Colonel from earlier is actually from the Venus globe, and is actually the real reason why these wars are starting. When he saw the mutation, he saw that humanity was getting weaker, so he decided to head towards Earth, where that won't be a problem. But then there's a problem. Humanity already exists on the Earth, so in order for them to get wiped out, he developed a survival of the fittest mentality, while also bringing the blueprints of Hermes to the Earth, which is why we have different mobile suits developed on the planet despite them being taboo, and uses that to influence humanity on Earth, which eventually they'll kill each other off and they'll be able to move back to the Earth. This in turn inspired the space people to want to head back to Earth like the Red Fleet, but also inspired another faction called the G-Reco Laboratory, which they preserve and improve technology from the Universal Century. And their goal is similar to them, but it's not because of the mutation, but because they're a bunch of space races that believes that humanity needs to be wiped out off the Earth so they can live on it. But it turns out they're not experienced at all, and they kind of mess things up even more. And you see the problem here, right? Is that it's so complex and complicated that it's kind of hard to understand. Which, no, I'm not saying those types of stories are bad. The original Gundam's plot was a bit complex.
聞こう。知っておるか。アドルフ・ヒトラー。ヒトラー。中世紀の人物ですな。
Okay, it was really complex, but at least it was easy to understand. How even Turn A's plot is also a bit complicated. To its detriment. But you can still understand it to an extent. And while G-Reco is complex, it doesn't really tell us much of anything. And the entire thing gets so convoluted that it kind of gets all over the place. May I remind you that the entire reason why this conflict existed was because of banning solar panels. And worse yet, this is a show that also explains a lot of things, while also doesn't explain anything. Like, we do get some exposition about the world building and lore, but with other stuff in the story that could be important, they either not explain it well enough at all, or they don't explain it at all, and you gotta figure it out for yourself. Which I should point out, I'm not saying that I'm not against that type of storytelling. I understand that Shoto tells an important thing, and even anime has done this before, believe it or not. My problem is that it's done really poorly, and it actually reminded me of another franchise that did the same thing, and it turned out to be a disaster. Why do we need all these political aspects of the world when we could do some other shit that nobody asked for? There are even some plot points that get sidetracked so much, they kind of become irrelevant. A good example would be the Toasongans and the Venus Globe. Now on paper, they're actually not a bad idea. Having bigger powers interfere with smaller conflicts can be intriguing. But by the end of G-Reco, the Toasongans became pointless to the narrative. They became one of the biggest threats of the entirety of G-Reco, becoming an absolute joke. The fucking old bastard dies, and Iruma becomes crazy after her death of her lover, and she goes on a killing spree, only getting herself and her ship killed. In fact, I think the only guy that survives is called Turbo. If anything, the Venus Globe guys are actually more important than the Toasongans. They could have easily made the Toasongans and the Venus Globe into one faction, and no one would really notice. Because there really is not much difference between them anyway. They're that pointless. A lot of things become pointless, except for the Americans' issue with energy, and the issue with the Kuntalas, but we'll get to that later. But my biggest issue, and the biggest missed opportunity in my opinion, is the space elevator and the religion revolving around it. Now at the beginning, they made it really clear that this religion has a lot of influence in the world of G-Reco, that a lot of people followed, even the capital of the world. So you would think they'll incorporate that into the story, right?
Nope.
Throughout the anime, they slowly phased it out to the point that I actually kind of forgot, and it became totally worthless in the entire story. They don't even do the trope of their religion being corrupt. After all, organized religion being corrupted is a very common trope, especially in Japanese media. And I know there's some religious people that use politics to their advantage, which, let's be honest here, can be relatively interesting. But my issue comes to the fact that the whole religious aspect to the story barely gets used at all.
Ooh, that's kind of small.
Like, we don't know if they have an afterlife, having some form of mythology, having some text or rituals, or anything. All we really know is that these people do not like certain technology that other people are using, and if you use that technology, you'll get cursed. So what's even the point of having this religion if you're not going to use that to the story? This could have been a political party, and it wouldn't be no different. Like, the whole point of the anime is about your ideas and values being based on your own culture, which includes religion. Why not base this more on the Crusades and base all that religion on the Universal Century? Think about it. The Crusades were a religious war fought by the Christians and the Muslims. So would it have been more interesting in G-Reco that the entire thing was religiously motivated and it was based on the entire history of the Universal Century? Not only that the religion would be more important to the overall story, but you could still have the ideas and themes about people being influenced by their own culture, plus you can have all the fan service you want from the Universal Century and be justified doing it. Fuck, even the Reconguista was religiously motivated. I mean, why not? It seems like a win-win to me. I mean, there's so much potential that you could have done here. and they wasted it all by simply not doing much with it. Do you see why I'm a bit upset by this?